I want to invite you to notice what happens inside your body when you hear the word narcissist. Just feel into that for a moment. For many of us, there is a sudden tightening in the chest, a slight constriction in the throat, or perhaps a familiar old anxiety that ripples through the stomach. We live in a culture that loves to weaponize this word. We use it to describe the arrogant boss, the self-absorbed partner, the politician on the screen. We view the narcissist as a monster, an aggressive, all-powerful force intent on dominating our lives. But what if I told you that we have been looking at the dynamic entirely backwards? What if the intense dread we feel isn't because they are all-powerful, but because we are standing on the precipice of our own buried power? The truth we rarely talk about is that the narcissist is not operating from strength. They are operating from a state of profound, catastrophic internal fragmentation. Their entire existence is a desperate daily construction project designed to keep a deep, early childhood wound from seeing the light of day. And because that tower is made of cards, nothing, absolutely nothing, frightens them more than a person who has decided to stop playing along with the illusion. In the next few minutes, we are going to explore why your healing, your joy, and your refusal to minimize yourself is the ultimate disruption to their world. We are going to look at the exact psychological mechanics of why a thriving, fully alive version of you represents an existential threat to their survival strategy. If you have ever felt trapped in the orbit of someone who demanded you stay small, what we are about to unpack will give you the precise clarity you need to finally reclaim your energy, break the cycle of automatic compliance, and understand exactly why your wholeness is the one thing they cannot tolerate. Let's look at what is actually happening beneath the surface. When we look at the behavior of the person we call a narcissist, we see grandiosity, we see control, manipulation, and an apparent inability to see or value the internal world of another human being. It is incredibly painful to experience. But if we want to understand why a thriving you threatens this dynamic, we must first look at what narcissism actually is. It is not a disease of overinflated self-love. It is a defense mechanism. In our early years, we all have two fundamental needs: attachment and authenticity. Attachment is our need for connection, to be held, to be seen, to be safe. Authenticity is our ability to know what we feel, to be connected to our gut feelings, and to express who we are. When a child's environment makes it unsafe to be authentic, when showing their true vulnerability leads to rejection, abandonment, or emotional neglect, the child makes a tragic choice. To survive, they abandon their authentic self. They disconnect from their own pain because it is too much for a young nervous system to bear. In place of that rejected, wounded self, they construct a persona, an idealized, invulnerable mask. But because this mask is artificial, it has no internal power source. It cannot generate its own sense of worth. It requires constant, unceasing external validation. It needs what the psychologists call supply. It needs you to either mirror its greatness, or it needs to control your reactions so it can feel powerful. Now look at what happens when you begin to thrive. To thrive does not mean you have a perfect life, or that you never feel pain. To thrive means you have begun the sacred work of reconnecting to yourself. You are listening to your body again. When someone crosses a line, your gut says no, and instead of suppressing that feeling to keep the peace, you honor it. You stop fawning. You stop abandoning yourself to keep the attachment alive. The moment you do this, the narcissist's entire system goes into crisis. Why? Because a thriving person is no longer a mirror. When you are grounded in your own reality, you cannot be gaslit. If someone tells you that your perception of reality is wrong, or that your hurt feelings are just you being too sensitive, a thriving person doesn't spiral into self-doubt. They look at the behavior with curiosity and compassion, but they remain anchored in their own truth. This removes the narcissist's control. It forces them to look at the one thing their entire personality was built to avoid, their own empty, unhealed space. Your vitality, your joy, and your boundaries act as a spotlight. They shine a light directly on the illusion of the mask. The narcissist doesn't hate you because you are doing well. They are terrified because your wholeness proves that the external validation they have spent a lifetime chasing is a false god. They see that they can no longer use your nervous system to regulate theirs. So if you find yourself facing pushback, anger, or increased attempts to pull you down as you begin to heal and grow, I want you to understand it for what it truly is. It is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is the predictable, frantic reaction of a fragile system encountering a force it cannot assimilate. Your thriving is not an act of aggression against them. It is simply an act of alignment with life. By choosing to be whole, by refusing to live in the shadow of someone else's unexamined trauma, you are doing the most revolutionary thing a human being can do. You are declaring that the pain stopped here. You are choosing authenticity over compliance. And in that space of true, vibrant self-connection, you become entirely, beautifully untamable. To truly understand why a thriving version of yourself poses such a monumental threat to a narcissist, we must first dismantle the cultural mythology surrounding the condition itself. In our modern discourse, we tend to view narcissism as an excess of self-love. We look at the vanity, the grandiosity, the relentless demand for attention, and we assume we are looking at someone who thinks entirely too highly of themselves. But if we look beneath the surface with a sense of compassionate curiosity, we discover that the reality is precisely the opposite. Narcissism is not an abundance of self-love. It is a profound, agonizing, and buried absence of it. What looks like an inflated ego is actually a rigid, desperate psychological defense structure built over a hollow core of deep-seated shame and early childhood fragmentation. When a child grows up in an environment where their authentic vulnerability is met with emotional neglect, conditional acceptance, or outright rejection, the pain of being unseen is too much for their developing nervous system to integrate. To survive, the child makes a tragic compromise. They disconnect from their true vulnerable self, which feels unsafe and unlovable, and construct an artificial, invulnerable persona. They build a mask of perfection, superiority, or absolute self-sufficiency. But because this mask is entirely artificial, it possesses no internal engine. It cannot generate its own sense of worth, security, or warmth. It is a structure that requires constant, unceasing maintenance from the outside world. This is where the concept of the narcissist as a consumer of human energy comes into focus. Because they cannot self-regulate or generate internal validation, they are forced to use the people around them as external emotional regulators. They require you to act as a mirror that reflects back only their idealized image, or they need to dominate your emotional state so they can feel a sense of power and control. They depend on your compliance, your guilt, your anger, or your desperation to fuel their fragile sense of existence. This is what psychological frameworks call narcissistic supply. It is not a luxury for them, it is an absolute survival necessity. Without it, the artificial mask collapses, and they are forced to confront the terrifying abyss of their own unhealed, abandoned childhood trauma. When we view the dynamic through this lens, we begin to realize that the narcissist is trapped in a state of perpetual, frantic dependency on the reactions of others. They are entirely tethered to how well they can manipulate their environment to avoid their own internal pain. They do not see you as a separate human being with your own independent feelings, needs, and destiny. They see you as an extension of themselves, a functional utility whose sole purpose is to keep their psychological tower of cards from falling down. Their grandiosity is a shield against absolute worthlessness, and their control over you is the only way they know how to feel safe in a world that originally taught them that vulnerability equals destruction. It is a tragic, deeply entrenched cycle of suffering, and it forms the foundation of why any shift in your own emotional state ripples so violently through their entire universe. By recognizing that their behavior stems from a catastrophic internal emptiness rather than genuine power, we stop viewing them as omnipotent forces and begin to see the precise, fragile mechanics of the cage they inhabit. When we understand that the narcissist's entire psychological survival depends on their ability to extract external validation and control, we can begin to see the precise anatomy of the threat that a thriving individual poses. To the narcissist, a person who is small, anxious, hypervigilant, and constantly trying to please them is a highly reliable source of emotional supply. When you are stuck in that state of trauma-induced compliance, your nervous system is essentially tethered to theirs. Your moods, your boundaries, and your sense of self fluctuate entirely based on how they treat you. This gives the narcissist a profound sense of safety, because they can predict and manipulate your reactions to keep their own buried shame at bay. But the moment you begin to truly thrive, the moment you start healing, finding your voice, and reconnecting with your own worth, that entire predictable system begins to shatter. Thriving means that you are no longer seeking their permission to exist or looking to them to define your reality. You stop responding to the subtle guilt trips, the passive-aggressive jabs, and the manufactured crises designed to pull you back into the emotional orbit of their needs. This sudden absence of your usual reaction creates an immediate, terrifying void in the narcissist's world. They are suddenly stripped of their primary defense mechanism because they can no longer use your emotional dysregulation to avoid their own. For a narcissist, your indifference or your calm, unshakable stability is the ultimate injury, because it demonstrates that their perceived power over you was an illusion. When they throw an emotional tantrum or attempt to manipulate a situation, and you meet it with grounded presence rather than defensive anxiety, you are effectively refusing to play your assigned role in their internal drama. You cease to be a functional utility that mirrors their greatness or absorbs their toxicity. This is a terrifying revelation for them because it forces their psychological system to confront the reality that they cannot control their environment as completely as they need to in order to feel safe. Your autonomy shines an intolerable light on their dependency, exposing the reality that the emperor has no clothes. Because they lack the internal capacity to process this sudden loss of control, your growth is not interpreted by them as a positive step for you. It is perceived as a direct, aggressive act of hostility against their survival. They view your boundaries not as healthy personal limits, but as barriers meant to starve them of the validation they require to stay emotionally afloat. A thriving version of you represents an existential threat because you have effectively broken the invisible contract that kept their fragile persona intact. By withdrawing your energy and choosing to invest it back into your own life, your own joy, and your own healing, you leave them entirely alone with the one thing they have spent a lifetime running from: the immense, unhealed cavity of their own childhood pain and empty selfhood. To truly appreciate why your growth is so disruptive to a narcissist, we must look at the profound shift that occurs within your own nervous system when you move from automatic reaction to conscious, grounded response. When we have been exposed to relational trauma or prolonged manipulation, our bodies naturally adapt by developing survival strategies. We learn to fawn, which means we compulsively please and placate the person threatening us, abandoning our own needs to ensure our safety. We learn to fight, entering into endless, exhausting arguments, trying to prove our worth or force the other person to see our perspective. Or we freeze and shut down, numbing ourselves to the reality of our own pain just to get through the day. These are not conscious choices. They are intelligent, automatic survival responses driven by a nervous system that perceives a threat to its attachment or emotional survival. For a long time, the narcissist relies heavily on these automatic trauma responses. Your frantic explanations, your tears, your anger, and your desperate attempts to fix things are all forms of intense emotional energy that validate their distorted sense of importance and control. But as you begin to heal, a beautiful and radical transformation takes place. You begin to step out of the reactive, survival-driven parts of your brain and move into the conscious presence of your true self. You start to notice the familiar hooks, the blame shifting, the subtle insults, the shifting goalposts. But instead of being instantly swept away by the old tidal wave of anxiety or defensiveness, you pause. You feel the physical sensation of the trigger in your body, but you do not allow it to dictate your next move. This is the transition from reaction to response. When you respond rather than react, you bring a quiet, unshakable stillness into an environment that depends on chaos. You no longer enter the arena to defend your character against false accusations because you no longer need the narcissist to agree with your version of the truth. You stop trying to change their mind or make them understand how much they have hurt you, because you have finally accepted that they do not possess the emotional capacity to hold that awareness. This shift entirely paralyzes the narcissist's usual tactics. Their manipulation requires your participation. It demands that you lose your footing so they can remain standing. When they throw a punch of emotional invalidation and it meets a wall of calm, clear-eyed presence, the energy of that attack has nowhere to go and snaps right back onto them. By remaining anchored in your own body and your own reality, you break the invisible psychological strings that allowed them to pull your levers for so long. You become a neutral observer of their drama rather than an active participant in it. This evolution of your nervous system is the ultimate declaration of independence, proving that you are no longer operating from the old wounds of the past, but from a place of adult agency and internal authority that can no longer be hijacked by their emotional storms. When we examine the deeper dimensions of healing, we find that authenticity is not merely an abstract concept or a psychological ideal. It is a visceral, biological reality that functions as an absolute, unbreachable boundary. In a state of chronic relational trauma, we are forced to disconnect from our bodies. We learn to ignore the knot in our stomach, the tightening in our throat, or the sudden exhaustion that overcomes us when our boundaries are violated, because acknowledging those signals would threaten the attachment we are trying to preserve. We trade our authenticity for a false sense of security, allowing our perception of reality to be overwritten by the demands and distortions of the narcissist. But as you begin to thrive, the journey of healing forces a profound reunion with your physical self. You begin to inhabit your body again, developing what is known as interoceptive awareness, the ability to feel and correctly interpret the internal signals of your own nervous system. When this reunion occurs, authenticity becomes your default state of being, and it completely alters the energetic field of the relationship. A person who is genuinely connected to their true feelings and somatic experiences carries an inherent gravity that cannot be easily manipulated or gaslit. When the narcissist attempts to rewrite history, shift blame, or minimize your pain, their words instantly collide with the solid wall of your felt sense of reality. Your body knows what happened, your nervous system remembers the truth, and you no longer possess the capacity to override that internal data to keep someone else comfortable. This creates a massive crisis for the narcissist because their entire control strategy relies on your willingness to doubt your own sanity and accept their version of the world. They need you to be disconnected from your gut feelings so they can implant their own narratives, insecurities, and projections into your mind. When you are authentic, you become psychologically non-porous. You can listen to their accusations or distortions without absorbing them as your truth. You recognize them simply as manifestations of their own internal dysregulation. This embodiment of truth completely disarms the narcissist's primary tool of gaslighting, because you can no longer be coerced into apologizing for things you did not do or minimizing your own valid needs. Your presence alone becomes an unyielding boundary that demands respect, not through aggressive posturing or loud arguments, but through the quiet, absolute refusal to participate in an illusion. You stop abandoning your own perceptions to appease their fragile ego, and you stop pretending that harmful behavior is acceptable. This level of self-alignment is deeply terrifying to a narcissist because it signifies that you are no longer malleable. You have stepped out of the fog of confusion and into the clear light of self-trust. And in doing so, you have stripped them of the ability to define who you are, how you should feel, or what you are allowed to believe. When we step back and look at the macrocosm of personal healing, we begin to realize that our individual journey out of the dynamics of manipulation and control is never just about us. It is an act of profound collective liberation and a direct disruption of generational trauma. Trauma is not just what happens to us, it is what happens inside us as a result of what happened to us. And it has a terrible habit of passing itself down through the bloodlines like an invisible heirloom. The patterns of narcissism and codependency do not emerge from a vacuum. They are the inherited, unexamined coping strategies of ancestors who did not have the tools, the safety, or the awareness to heal their own broken hearts. When a family system has been operating for decades, perhaps even centuries, on a currency of emotional suppression, conditional love, and the sacrifice of authenticity for the sake of survival, the appearance of a person who refuses to play the game is an earthquake. The narcissist in your life is often the current custodian of that generational trauma, acting out the unresolved defense mechanisms of the past with a rigid, desperate intensity. When you choose to step out of the dance of codependency, when you refuse to let your energy be harvested to sustain an illusion, and when you commit yourself to the radical act of thriving, you are not just changing your own life, you are actively interrupting the transmission of that historical pain. You are throwing a massive wrench into a multi-generational machine that has demanded compliance at the expense of human vitality. This is why the resistance you face from a narcissist when you begin to heal feels so ancient and heavy. It is because you are wrestling not just with an individual person, but with an entire legacy of unresolved suffering that is fighting for its right to continue existing through you. By standing firm in your wholeness and choosing to process the grief, the anger, and the terror that surfaced during recovery, you ensure that this pain does not get passed on to the next generation. You become a transitional character, a person who, in the crucible of their own suffering, filters out the toxins of the past and releases something entirely new into the future. A thriving version of you is a living, breathing proof that the cycle can be broken, that trauma does not have the final word, and that a human being can emerge from the ashes of emotional devastation with their capacity for joy, connection, and authenticity fully intact. This is the deepest reason why your healing is an existential threat to the narcissist's world. Your transformation demonstrates that the very suffering they use to justify their toxic defense mechanisms is not an absolute destiny, but a wound that can be healed. Your vitality serves as a quiet, powerful cosmic verdict that reveals manipulation to be a hollow path and authenticity to be the ultimate truth of human existence. By reclaiming your life, you rewrite the code of what is possible, lifting a lamp for others who are still lost in the dark fog of compliance, and declaring to the universe that the legacy of pain ends with you.